No. The green light's on, but it doesn't appear to be on the air.
Yes, it's on.
But it's not on the air. I'm not going across. Or is it closed down there?
What do you mean? I can hear you.
Can you hear me up there? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. They can't hear me down here. All right, fine. Okay.
I can put it louder.
A little bit louder. A little bit louder. Okay, fine. Can't hear myself. Can you hear? Okay.
Speak.
Hello now? Hello, can you hear me now? Who can hear me? It's these ones that you've knocked out, which is good. Okay, speed it up again. Right. Hello there, can you hear me? Okay. We're going to try a new experiment today and work from this side. My friend here tells me he's fixed the whole apparatus, but if it hasn't, well, Professor Fugel says if I speak from here, it's not likely to be interfered with by the loudspeaker above, which doesn't sound too brilliant at the moment, I must say. But if you can't hear me, please put up your hand. And if you really can't hear me, there are a few unoccupied places in the front here, and I promise I won't call you up to do any acts if you come and sit in the front row. Now,
how many people don't have notes?
First of all, they prepared notes for 100, and thank you very much for the huge attendance. If you haven't got notes, can you put up your hands so that we know how many people require these to be printed tomorrow? Okay.
Did they make any extras of the part one?
Yes, we've got some extras of part one. Is there anybody here who still needs part one?
There's a spare.
A spare for someone, okay.
All right, we'll have some extras of part one and we'll have 30 copies of part two tomorrow. Well.
And an extra 30 of part three then. Okay. Right, the other interesting thing is that at 3:30 today, down in the New Economics buildings, there's a film on the Lighthouse Stevensons, which I'll be talking about in brief in the course of today. And if you'd like to have the real accurate version and the real extensive version, then perhaps you'd like to pop down to the New Economics building if you're free at that time. The Lighthouse Stevensons film at 3:30 today. My father was the keeper of the Eddystone light, and he slept with a mermaid one fine night. The result of the union was 3, a porpoise and a porgy, and the other was me. These Cornish folk songs and shanties reflect the very nasty nature of the Cornish and Devon coasts. But for centuries, the British authorities were completely callous about shipwrecks. Sailors were expendable, ships were replaceable, and if cargoes were important, well, it was up to the merchants to do something about it. And as we found yesterday, the merchants were able to influence landowners to erect lights, and it was to everybody's mutual advantage because the light owners then received quite a hefty income. So the private lights appeared, sponsored by the altruistic benefactors, could turn in a worthwhile profit. And so the typical promontories which enjoyed the protection were in the Kentish side, Dungeness and the South Foreland, and where we are now in the Cornwall end, Portland Bill and the Lizard and Start Point. Many of these private lights were unreliable, and they were not popular with all the population because the poor coastal communities made a very handsome living out of shipwrecks. the Cornish population considered it was their right to benefit from the salvage of wrecks. And even to the point where they would put out lights and hope for a wreck, or otherwise put up a false light and similarly benefit. And the Cornish children were supposed to go to sleep saying, "God bless Daddy and God bless Mommy, and please send us a wreck that we can eat tomorrow night." So here's the Cornish coast with these nasty points like the Lizard, Start Point, and Portland Bill, all hazards for the unwary mariner. And then offshore were Wolf Rock round Land's End and the Longship's Rock, which again claimed many wrecks. But the nastiest of them all, in the middle of the roadstead leading to Plymouth, were the Eddystone Rocks. It's about 14 miles south of Plymouth. There are 3 ridges on this group of rocks, about 300 meters long, and they're exposed at low tide, displaying rusty red fangs, which are sometimes look like a child's idea of what a crocodile looks like. The reef rises almost vertically from the floor, so there's rarely breakers around it to advertise its presence, and it was an accepted hazard, and there seemed to be no way of doing anything about it because nobody knew how to build a lighthouse on a rock. That is until a man called Winstanley arrived on the scene. And there are poems about him. The Victorian poetess Jean Ingelow came along with Winstanley's deed, you kindly folk, with it I fill my lay, a nobler man ne'er walked the world, let his name but be what it may. Now, Winstanley was a farm boy born near Saffron Walden, quite away from the sea in Suffolk. And he grew up near to a large stately home called Audley End, which then as now the owner was in some financial difficulty, and he found a way to sort himself out by inviting the King, Charles II, to hold court at Audley End instead of in London, because the Great Plague was rife in the town. So Charles was very happy to go to Audley End because it was near to Newcastle. Newcastle in the 17th century was a sort of Las Vegas or Sun City, and there were gambling dens there, there were horse races, of course, and there were establishments run by titled ladies which offered pleasures to Charles and various other gentlemen of the time. And so Charles dropped in at Audley End, and Winstanley, a bright lad, saw his way to make himself a bit useful, and he soon became very popular with the people there, Charles and his court, including Sir Christopher Wren, and he invented some water fountains to put on the tables amongst the candelabras and things like that, which impressed them, and the king was quite interested. And Winstanley then carried on, and he taught himself engraving, which was a very important thing in those days because it's the way all printing went, and went a bit further than that and made himself some educative playing cards, which were all the rage. The playing cards had a wealth of information on them. I think I've got a copy here, haven't I? Yes, a playing card like this with a wealth of information, in this case about America, and presumably the aces or whatever this was had information about the 4 continents. Where Winstanley got the information from, I wouldn't know. As I say, a poor farm boy in Suffolk, and he knew all about America and how it was founded, and presumably Africa and so on, and some of it was fanciful, but he obviously didn't look it up in Wikipedia or even an encyclopedia in those days. So he made a lot of money out of this, people enjoyed it, and So he spent this by acquiring a property in the nearby village of Littlebury, which he turned into a fabulous water theatre. He was an inventor and a magician, and in this house he had all sorts of practical jokes. It was sort of cross between a circus and a ghost train, and if you came in there and you sat in a chair, you were liable to be tipped into the river. And there were all sorts of distorting mirrors and things like that, which are great fun. And people paid a shilling, and they came from far and wide to come and see the great show in Littlebury. And one of the great customers was Charles II, who went down there partly out of amusement, but partly because it was quite useful, because in the next village of Newport, he'd indulged in a little bit of property speculation, and he'd put a manager in there, and he liked to go and check whether the bed linen had been aired properly. The manager's name was Nell Gwynn. You see, and he used to pop down to Newport where this lady was established, and on the way back he'd pop into Winstanley's show, and when he came back he'd tell old Queen Catherine of Braganza, the one who drank the tea, I just went to see Winstanley's latest trick, and she said, "Oh, you must take me sometime, dear." No, you're far too fair to be seen in a distorting mirror. No, you stay at home. So Winstanley, known to Charles II and royalty and the court, decides then, he's doing so well here, move it to London, and he takes his fabulous water theatre to London, sets it up near Hyde Park, has some wonderful tricks there. The main one was a barrel which on command dispensed brandy or wine or beer or coffee or whatever it was, all out of the same spout. It was a magician's trick which is still sometimes done today, and was very popular. And he made now enough money to go a step further. He was terribly ambitious, and he wanted to be well known, and he wanted to be like his idol, Sir Christopher Wren, who he'd met. And so his next step was to buy a fleet of ships. And he had a fleet of 5 little ships that were very useful trading in those days. England was a trading nation, making quite a bit of money now, until one Christmas Eve he's having a quiet drink in a London pub, and some chaps break in and say, "Winstanley, we're terribly sorry to tell you, but 2 of your ships are foundered on the Eddystone rock." And Winstanley can't believe this, so he rushes off down to Devon to see what this rock is all about, and he takes a look at it. And immediately he gets the idea that he will now really make his name. He will build a lighthouse on this rock, build a lighthouse on a wave-swept rock that's never been done anywhere in the world before. And he goes about it quite sensibly, and he spends an entire summer with his crew that he's collected from Plymouth, and they have to row out 11 miles or whatever the distance was every day to the rock, and they prepare the rock for the base, and they drill holes there, and they put in stanchions, and they solder the thing together, as Sostratus had done in the ancient lighthouse that we talked about yesterday. They put in the stanchions, and he pours in lead to solder the whole thing to the rock, which was a very decent sort of base. And he then gets going with building the superstructure. Not without problems, because the second year now, when they're building the lighthouse itself, some pirates, some French pirates come along and decide that'll be difficult, so they collect all the workmen, put them in the boat and set them adrift, and they take Winstanley off to France and lock him up in jail. So fortunately, Winstanley has these royal connections, and it's now William of Orange on the throne, and William talks to Louis the 14th, I suppose it was, and Louis thinks it's a great joke and suggests to Winstanley, why build it on the English side? Come and build some rock lighthouses off the coast of Brittany, where we need them very badly as well. But Winstanley declines, and he's sent back, and he gathers his crew again. Why they were so happy to come with him, I don't know. But he sets to build this lighthouse, the most incredible and magnificent lighthouse that you've ever seen. And it started to look like this, out of iron, wood, and brick, with all sorts of decorations on it and a light at the top. And it looked like it was very good. And the first lights were shown on the 14th of November 1698. There was pandemonium in Plymouth when the light was seen. At last something was happening. We were going to be able to mark this dreadful rock. But Winstanley couldn't join in the celebrations because he was holed up in his lighthouse right until the day before Christmas, when he and his crew eventually got back to Plymouth because the weather had been so bad. Well, he wasn't satisfied with this lighthouse. It wasn't tall enough. And so the following year, in 1699, he came and rebuilt the thing to the most magnificent and strange lighthouse that you've ever seen, with all sorts of embellishments. And as we learnt yesterday, you don't want all sorts of embellishments on the side of your lighthouse because it causes the wind to be even more difficult. But he had this lift for the passengers to get, or the workmen to get into the lighthouse, and he had a place for them to fish from here. And there we are, there's a chap fishing out of there, and he's got some other things, and a huge flag which, if it was blowing alone, would have pulled the whole thing over, and a windsock on the top. Grand thing. We know this in detail because Winstanley, the engraver, made a model of this, which I think is in Plymouth Museum today. And so he's got a grand lighthouse which works and lasts until 1703. At this stage, Winstanley is quite famous, but he's still not satisfied, and he wants to actually see how the lighthouse performs when he's in it during a substantial storm. Well, November 1703, there becomes word of one of these Gulf of Mexico hurricanes that we hear about hitting the coast of America. This one got lost and came across the Atlantic, and the ships before it brought word that this was going to happen. There's going to be a big storm. So all the ships were holed up in their harbours, and Winstanley went out to the lighthouse to see how the storm behaved. Well, the storm hit. It's apparently the worst storm ever to hit England. A journalist called Daniel Defoe, whom you might have heard about, did some research in Kent the day afterwards. There were 17,000 trees that he counted that were blown down in Kent alone. The Bishop of Bath and Wells was killed because the chimney of his residence collapsed. The Navy lost umpteen ships and 1,611 men in the estuaries, in the Solent and wherever they were held up. It was a terrible storm. The mayor of Deal had to go out in his own boat to collect 200 men who were stranded on the Goodwin Sands. And in the middle of this, a ship passed Winstanley's lighthouse at midnight and saw the light. And in the next morning, all that was remaining of Winstanley's lighthouse was some of those twisted stanchions stuck into the rock. The lighthouse had disappeared, and so had Winstanley, but he achieved the immortality that he had sought. Well, Plymouth wasn't to be denied, and they now had a marker on the lock, and they knew it was possible. So an altruistic man called Lovett took the lease on the rock, and he engaged a man called Rudyerd to build a new lighthouse. Rudyerd was a silk merchant, and what he knew about lighthouses we don't know, or about any sort of construction, whatever. But again, he did the job properly, and he decided to go the opposite way to Winstanley, and he'd build a clean tower with as little resistance to the wind as possible. He would make it out of alternate layers of timber and stone in the tower itself, so that there was some flexibility he thought was necessary. And then he clad the whole thing in timber, and there was a light at the top, which was very nice, and it burned for about 50 years, when, unfortunately, maybe the keepers were a bit careless, but the lamp fell over, and the lighthouse caught fire, and there was a dreadful problem, and the keepers had to rush to the edge here and keep out of the lighthouse, which was burning down. And strangely, the oldest keeper, whose name was William Hall, and he was apparently 84 years old, and some sources say 94 years old, he was gazing up at the fire that was going on here and kept his mouth open, and an ingot of lead fell into his mouth and he swallowed it. And the people were rescued the next day and taken to hospital in Plymouth to see what was, whether there was any problems, and Hall seemed to be perfectly all right, and then he died a week later. And the doctor who attended him was interested and did an autopsy and found this 7-ounce lump of lead in his stomach, which nobody believed. And the doctor then did a whole lot of experiments on dogs to see whether it was possible to swallow lead and survive for a week or two. The ingot is still around, apparently, in the Edinburgh Medical Museum. But that was Rudyerd's lighthouse gone as well. Now the people of Plymouth now want a better lighthouse than that. And Mr. Lovett decides, okay, we're not going to mess around anymore. We'll get an expert to design a lighthouse. Who's an expert? Well, nobody designed a lighthouse before, so they didn't know. Apply to the Royal Society, please send me an expert who is likely to build a lasting lighthouse. And so they sent him a 30-year-old called John Smeaton, who came from Leeds, where his father was a solicitor. As a small boy, he displayed a talent for engineering. He built working models of steam engines and pumps, and obviously he was going to be an engineer. And by 1772, he had his own practice. And beside this white lighthouse we're going to talk about, he built harbours at Ramsgate and Aberdeen, and steam engines in advance of Bolton and Watt, and Blackfriars Bridge. He was a famous engineer of the day. In fact, the first engineer to call himself a civil engineer, as opposed to the military engineers. And Smeaton came along and decided that he would look at this very carefully. As he would do today, he did a desk study beforehand and thought, how should a lighthouse be designed? It should be like an oak tree, he said. Very strong at the bottom, thick at the bottom, and gradually tapering upwards, as smooth as possible, as higher than the likelihood of spray. This is how he went about it. But he had another problem. Cement hadn't been invented at the time. There was only limestone, which plagued him no end. But what you do to keep the stones together? And after much thought, he realized that masonry blocks could be dovetailed together as in carpentry, which would require some very clever masons, but it could be done. And so the lighthouse was built on this premise. And there are the masonry blocks, as you see them now, all fitting to one another, and then vertically they had these staves which came up and linked each course to the one beneath it. These blocks, a couple of tons each, they were carefully made on shore, assembled, marked, taken out to the rock, which had been prepared for them, and up went the lighthouse very successfully. So you can see what the living arrangements here as we go up this. The This would be the storeroom where the fuel for the light as well as the food for the keepers were kept. Then there'd be a bedroom, a mess room, and the watch room, and finally the light on the top of it. And the lighthouse resisted the elements for many, many years until the problem came along when it appeared that the rock which held the lighthouse up, not the lighthouse itself, but the rock here was being undermined by the sea, and the tower was beginning to wobble. So by this stage, Trinity House had taken over, and they got Sir James Douglas, who we met yesterday, to build a brand new lighthouse. And again, he went for interlocking blocks, a bit more sophisticated than the previous time, and now he's locking them horizontally as well as vertically, making a very careful job of it. You can see these huge blocks here having to be set up on shore and tested, and then taken out to the site of the lighthouse. And so up it goes slowly with the plinth under construction alongside the old lighthouse, which is due to be demolished and just exploded, in fact, when the new light is finished. Well, the people of Plymouth didn't like this idea at all. Their marvelous lighthouse that had served them so well for umpteen years was now going to be just consigned to the deep along with all the wrecks. So they forced the authorities to dismantle the upper part of Smeaton's lighthouse and re-erect it on Plymouth Hoe, and there it is today. And if you want to pay £2, you can go into it and see exactly how it felt to be in a lighthouse in 1800. And the new lighthouse, the new lighthouse now sits beside the stump of the old lighthouse and has been there ever since, and been modified as the years have gone on, but it's still very sound today. And alongside the stump, you can see how the old stones have remained and are available to see today if you can get yourself a ride out to the lighthouse. And just to show you what a lighthouse looked like in about 1880, this might be later because that looks like an electric stove there. But this is as cramped as it was, the kitchen, and the sleeping arrangements in the bunks, and you had to learn to sleep circular in a circular sort of fashion. And this is it today, with plenty of foam and rough water still around it, but it has been now made automatic, and it has got a helicopter pad on the top of it. Well, in 2003, it was reported that despite all the modern navigational aids, a calm sea, good visibility, and a 160-foot granite tower, a vessel from a well-known training establishment in Devon, which I presume is Dartmouth Naval College, it had managed to hit the Eddystone. And the excuse from the cadets, I presume, was that their GPS system was a mile out. So why do we have lighthouses, and why are we going to keep on having them? Because GPS systems can be a mile out, and the young watchkeepers hadn't been taught that the human eye should always check technology. There's some nasty little rocks in the Irish Sea which required attention. The Smalls here off St. David's Head was built by a man called Henry Whiteside. So many of these people appear to be amateurs. He was a musical instrument maker, and he built a very interesting idea on Smalls. which, see if we can come down and come back again. Was on stilts like this so that the waves could pass underneath it. And this was the accommodation, and there was the light. And it worked quite well. While they were building this, they had tremendous trouble, and Whiteside and his workers got stuck in the accommodation here, and they had to send for help by throwing the famous bottle over the edge. It begged immediate assistance to fetch us off the Smalls before the next spring, or we fear we shall perish. Our water is near all gone, our fire quite gone, and our house in a most melancholy manner. And 3 days later, the bottle washed up on the beach in front of the agent's house, where they went, and they were rescued, and it all happened. It all came together again. And there was another nasty and gruesome incident at the Smalls Lighthouse in 1801. The two keepers were Thomas Howells and Thomas Griffith, and they didn't get on very well. And in a freak accident, Griffith died. And Howells was fearful that if he just got rid of the body, he'd be accused of murder. So he kept the body. And after a week, it wasn't so nice having the body in the lighthouse. So he hung it outside, where it apparently knocked on the window. And after 3 weeks, help came. But poor old Howells was now completely beyond it and apparently never recovered from this gruesome incident. This lighthouse was replaced by a tower in 1859 by James Walker and James Douglas of Trinity House, and there's no sign of that lighthouse on stilts anymore. Now, at the same time, Trinity House had taken over. Douglas, a very competent man, started building more lighthouses on these rocks. Here's Wolf Rock, which takes its name from a blowhole, which in favorable circumstances produces a sound like the howling of a wolf. And in early times, this did provide some sort of warning to mariners. And the Cornish wreckers didn't like it, so they filled up the blowhole with lots of boulders and claimed more ships and claimed their legitimate booty, and they filled the hole with boulders and they stilled the foghorn. So Douglas built eventually a lighthouse here. It's not as pretty as many of the others. Its lines somehow are not quite so appealing, but it's there and it's doing a good job still. The Longship's Lighthouse is just near it, also near Land's End, also built by Douglas. Now what have we got? Oh, okay. Longship's Lighthouse, again in a stormy sea, right near where you turn off Land's End. And then there's Bishop Rock Lighthouse in the Scilly Isles, which again was a design which was coming out from Walker, and he wanted to build a lighthouse on piles, as we saw at the Smalls. And tower was completed apart from the lantern when the whole structure was washed away in a storm. So he gave up that idea and built a rock lighthouse, as you see today. Again, this was built rather taller because that little one was very often obscured by waves. And so the Bishop Rock's Lighthouse, a magnificent one, is there today. Again, I think you see it with the stump of the old lighthouse next to it. Well, this is the way how you had to get out to these lighthouses. You had to row out in those days, and it's quite backbreaking work. And when you got there, you got up to the lighthouse by a breeches buoy, which was an adventure in itself. And here it is today again with a helicopter landing pad on it. Rather nice picture. Now, James Douglas, who we met yesterday, came from a lighthouse family. His father had been a lighthouse engineer under Smeaton, and his brother was William Douglas, who, because he didn't have a job for him at Trinity House, because his brother was occupying it, he was the head of the Irish Lighthouse Board. And he built the Fastnet Lighthouse. It's a nasty rocky islet, 8 kilometers off the coast of Southern Ireland, and it's often called, it became in the 1920s in the famine, the island's teardrop, because it was the last part of Ireland that 19th century Irish immigrants saw as they sailed for New York. Today we know the Fastnet, of course, is the turning point of the famous race. Now, another interesting Irish lighthouse was this one at Tusker Rock off the coast of Wexford. And the scene of some 150 known wrecks before a light was built on it in 1815. Now, during the construction, the workmen's accommodation was swept away and 14 were drowned, and the remaining men clung to the rock for 2 days without food or water. But this interesting thing about this lighthouse was it's on the path of those wine merchants and other smugglers that were coming in from France with contraband. And this was a very convenient place for them to drop off their booty for the time being. They just left it on the rock here, sailed into Wexford, announced they had nothing to declare, and then they went round to the nearest cove and got a small boat from there and went and collected their barrels of brandy and so on. The only problem was that on one occasion the lighthouse keepers decided to tap the Admiral, I think it's called, or splice the main basically, also that is, and they found a bottle of brandy and they had a little sample of it, or a large sample of it. Unfortunately for them, the King's yacht was passing that night, and the captain reported that the light wasn't working. And the people came out from Wexford the next day and discovered the lighthouse keepers still prone on the floor and dead to the world. And well, the upshot of it was a very lucrative little business came to an end. Up the other side of England are the foreign islands, which were rocky and mostly barren outcrops off the Northumberland coast, inhabited by hermits and monks in the early days. They all got strange names: Piper Gut, Gun Rock, Big and Little Harker. And the people that eventually lived in them were a strange band of islanders with another reputation for wrecking and encouraging shipwrecks. And this was the scene on Longstone for the famous legend about Lighthouse, where the lighthouse keeper, one William Darling, and his daughter were watching a shipwreck one night, and the two of them rowed out to the shipwreck on the nearby island and rescued half a dozen people and took them to the lighthouse, which became a huge Victorian legend. And the lighthouse keeper and Grace Darling became a most celebrated heroine in Victorian literature and Victorian public. In fact, a subscription list was open for her. Swinburne and Wordsworth wrote poems about her, gifts, letters, proposals of marriage, and Queen Victoria sent her £50. Sadly, the bewildered girl didn't know what to do about it, and she only survived a further 2 years when she died from tuberculosis. But still, I'm finding books for children about Grace Darling. Well, across the way in Scotland, the coastline of Scotland is about 8,000 kilometers long when you take in all the islands and locks and peninsulas and so on. That's more than twice the length of South Africa's coast, and we haven't got an insignificant coast either. The western shore here is unprotected from the Atlantic gales, and the North Sea is full of riptides, and just round the top here, where the North Sea meets the Atlantic, there are all sorts of whirlpools and problems on sandbanks and reefs and hidden rocks, and altogether a very perilous shore. Well, Scotland was a bit luckier than England in a way, because it didn't have to bother about Trinity House. It had its own Northern Lights Board, who was supposed to take some interest in the safety of the coast. Well, we saw this one yesterday, the Isle of May, where they built a light in 1636 with a coal brazier on the top of it. And the single keeper was paid £7 a year and 30 bushels of meal. And twice weekly he had to retrieve coal and dumped offshore by the tender vessel and lug it up to the lighthouse and haul it to the top of the primitive crane. Grim existence, I think. And sadly, the light from the coal was very ineffective. You can see the Isle of May from here, and if he had to lug it up from the shore here to his lighthouse, well, that would have exhausted most people in any case. Now, we were told yesterday about the grandfather of the Scottish lighthouse industry, one Thomas Smith, who was apprenticed to an ironmonger, later set up on his own. It was a time when street lighting was becoming favourable, and it was being installed in various parts of Edinburgh, and Tom Smith saw his way as an ironmonger to manufacture iron lamp standards and worry about the lights themselves. And then he didn't like these just plain lights just flickering in the way, so he started looking at these parabolic reflectors and perfecting them and experimenting with them. And so he got this system of reflectors going and installed them on his lamps. Well, the Scottish Lighthouse Board, or the Northern Lights Board, decides that they want to do something about their lights now, and so they look for someone who knows something about lighthouses, something about lights, and they approach Tom Smith, who say he knows something about ironmongery. But at any rate, he goes and builds lighthouses, 3 or 4 or 5 on land, and installs lights there with these parabolic reflectors, and does quite well. Now, Tom Smith at this stage was widowed. He married a widow called Jean Stevenson. He had a daughter called Jean as well, and she had a son called Robert. And Robert was a very conscientious young boy, having to look after his mother. The parents got married. He married his, not even stepsister, whatever you might call her, but I mean, there's no reason why he couldn't marry her. So he married Jean Smith, and they had a whole bunch of children. Jane and Alan. Rob is in white because he didn't get into the lighthouse trade, but David and Thomas, they all got involved. And the next generation as well, and the next generation as well, until 1971, the Stevensons were in charge of the Scottish lighthouse industry, and around the world too. I mean, their firm had other lighthouses. So Tom Smith built these lighthouses at Kinnaird Head and North Ronaldsea and Ealing Gla and Mull of Kintyre. That one I can pronounce because I know the Beatles song. And when Tom retired, the firm was taken over by Robert, whom had been apprenticed now to Tom, been sent to university, had studied engineering, and could not only build lighthouses, could build bridges and railways and things like that when they came along. As I said, a very steadfast, a very serious young man, because he lost his father at an early age, and he was a very industrious chap as well. So Stevenson takes over the business, and immediately gets asked to build a lot more lights, and particularly the lighthouses, 15 in all, but particularly he gets asked to build one on a very nasty rock here. Oh, these are various lighthouses. Okay. So here's the rock called the Inchcape Rock. Let me go back a bit because I've got my notes on the previous one. The Inchcape Rock, it's a sunken ledge of red sandstone lying 12 miles east of Carnoustie and about 16 miles, good drive, north of the Royal and Ancient Club. It's directly in the fairway, so to speak, of the ships trying to get into Dundee and Perth. In 1799 alone, no fewer than 70 ships were wrecked on this nasty rock, including HMS York, lost with all hands, which resulted in a furore in Parliament and the Lighthouse Board being told to do something about it. Well, what did they do? They decided to get hold of their Robert Stevenson and see what he could do about it. And Stevenson went and investigated English lighthouses, including the Eddystone, and came back to the Inchcape Rock with a plan. The Inchcape Rock was famous because of a poem and a legend about the abbot who had placed a bell on the Inchcape Rock. When the buoy in the storm it floated and swung, and over the waves its warning rung. But this legend goes, a Dutch pirate called Sir Ralph the Rover came in out of spite, or maybe because he thought it was a good idea and he'd benefit from ships that were wrecked on the rock. He cut the bell and it sunk into the ocean below. And a few years later, having forgot about his misdeed, he himself came to grief on the Inchcape Rock. And Southey wrote a poem about it, which somebody said they had learnt another poem at school. Well, I learnt that one at school about the Inchcape Rock and Robert Southey. But Robert Stevenson is going to go and do the same sort of thing as at the Eddystone, with interlocking rocks, interlocking stones, which were made in a yard at Arbroath. But he decided that this was too far out at sea to actually row out each day, so he was going to build a large bunkhouse and workshop for his men, which he did. And again, it must have been pretty difficult there to live in this for an extended period. They spent the entire summer there, and then in winter time they went back to Arbroath and carried on preparing the stones for the following summer. And in 1811, this magnificent lighthouse was showing its first light and very successful in preventing further wreckage. Stevenson didn't mind a little bit of self-publicity, and he got Turner to paint this rather delightful picture of the Bell Rock in a storm. Well, Stevenson went on and retired, and he passed it to the running of the firm to his eldest son, Alan. He was a reluctant lighthouse engineer because he much preferred art and much preferred architecture and poetry, and he was a personal friend of Southey and Wordsworth and Sir Walter Scott. And he nevertheless felt it was his duty to take over the firm, and he built a large number of lighthouses too, including Ardnamurchan, which is on the westernmost point of the Scottish mainland. And it's built, and remember this one, It was built in the Egyptian revival style, and the year was 1849. Ardnamurchan Point is also perilous, so perilous that skippers who rounded it successfully were entitled to display a sprig of heather on their masthead to show that they survived getting round the point of Ardnamurchan. So Allen indulged in this Egyptian revival style, which doesn't come out so clearly there, but I don't know what Egyptian revival style is in any case, but he built this one in that style, and it's the only fancy lighthouse on the Scottish coast. And then he came up with his nastiest and most difficult job to that stage. There's a vicious rock here called the Skerry Vore, which had claimed many a ship as they sailed round the coast or even came in from the Atlantic. And he had to build this lighthouse there, which was going to be an enormous difficulty. He had to establish a harbour and a town virtually for the 150 workmen on this Isle of Tiree. And then they had to sail out each day to the Skerry Vore, where he built this enormous lighthouse. He decided to depart from tradition. It must have been quite bold, and I don't know what his father said about it. He wasn't going to have interlocking blocks. Purely the weight of the structure would keep it stable. And so up went the queen of all lighthouses, the Skerry Vore. Much taller than any others that we know, beautiful lines, regarded as something really special. The finest combination of maths with elegance to be met within architecture, law, engineering structures, the noblest of all deep-sea lights. And there you can see how they compare to our other lighthouses that we've been across, the Eddystone and the Bell Lock. This one's another 30 feet taller. Really a splendid lighthouse, an astonishing piece of engineering. Waves pounding the structure could exert a pressure of more than 3 tons a square foot, more than twice that experienced at the Bell Rock, and yet the tower has remained sound and safe until today. David Allen was one of the first sufferers from multiple sclerosis, and he died at quite an early age. The job went then to his brothers, David and Thomas. David was the practical one who did most of the building and designing. Thomas was the scientist who came out with 270 patents and improvements for lights and prisms and things like that. Their biggest challenge was a commission not from the Scottish board, but from the British Admiralty, to build a light on Muckle Flugger. Muckle Flugger is the most northerly point. Where's my light? Oh, there it is. Anyway, most northerly point of the entire British Isles. And in 1854, as some of you might have found out this morning earlier, the Crimean War was in progress, and Her Majesty's Northern Fleet was deployed in the area of the Shetlands to blockade the Russian Baltic Fleet from getting down to the Crimea. So the Muckle Flugger and these islands here were a terrible threat. And a light was needed on Muckle Flugger, and it was needed in a hurry, like in 6 months. Well, Muckle Flugger is an awful rock, which rises straight out of the ocean as before. The building, nevertheless, to get to it, they had to hew steps into this wet and slippery cliff. And they put a light up on it, said to have been completed in 28 days flat. and the light was first exhibited on the 11th of October 1854, and it was presumably successful in guiding the British fleet. As the structure itself was 50 feet in height, it was on a rock 200 feet above sea level. It was thought that it would withstand only wind and rain. However, when the winter gales began to break over the rock, it was found that the sea not only broke heavily on the tower, but on the light itself. And so the Stevensons built a rock around it. Why didn't the thing work? Anyway, they built a wall around the bottom of it to try and divert the waves, and nevertheless one particular wave came over the wall and broke down the hugely reinforced door of the lighthouse. This isn't the lighthouse that they built in such a hurry. They came back a year later and built the actual lighthouse. And then David decided that the company, the Stevenson brothers, or whatever they called themselves, were relying too heavily on the Northern Lights Board. So he concentrated on civil engineering, built several bridges and harbours around Scotland. And Thomas was left with another nasty little job to do, which he did all on his own. And this was a island, a rock called Doob Hartak. I always think about Muckle Flugger and wonder what the workmen called it itself. I'm sure they had a slightly different name for it. And Doob Hartak similarly must have been something about Hartak. And Thomas had to build a lighthouse here, which he did all by himself. And he put his son onto this nasty little rock to be a resident engineer for a while, because he wanted his son to follow the business. And when the lighthouse was complete and the son came back to the officers, Thomas said to him, "Right, my lad, off you go now, you're a lighthouse engineer." And the son said, "No, thanks very much, Dad, I don't think this is my scene." And father said, "Well, if you're not going to be a lighthouse engineer, you're missing a great opportunity. You could have been famous." And one likes to think that while holed up on Doob Hartak, Robert Louis Stevenson had thoughts about an island in warmer climes, maybe put down a few thoughts. He certainly incorporated much of his experience into Kidnapped and his other Scottish stories. So he also, incidentally, wrote a history of the Stevenson family, which the lady who wrote the book about the film that you might go and see just now must have lent on heavily, because it was about his family. So there's the amazing Stevenson family, not forgetting David, who followed in the next generation and built another 25 lighthouses. I think the 89 Stevenson lighthouses on the shores of Scotland, and many in other parts of the world. And here are just some of them that we've seen again today. And Robert came up with this tribute to his forebears and fathers and so on. The Bell Rock stands as a monument for my grandfather, the Skerryvore for my Uncle Alan, and when the lights come out along the shores of Scotland, I am proud to think that they burn more brightly for the genius of my father. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed today. And hopefully we'll see you tomorrow. Any questions? Margaret.
Two things. The Eddystone Lighthouse. The first one was built on that big rock. What did they build the second one on? Is there a rock under the rock?
Oh, there's a whole series of rocks there. And so the question is, how did they build the Eddystone rock? It's not just a single rock. It's a reef about 300 yards